as outsiders, we had a lot of fun listening to all of that. So thank you for that. Right now, happy to call on stage an esteemed TCF supporter, who is the CEO of GH Labs and board member with the Skoll Foundation. Also, our alumni, Nadeem Hussain, who I believe everybody knows by now, has a special message for him. And he wanted to send his thanks because this particular individual helped him and Amjad Nurani Saab while they were writing their book and trying to publish it, Agents of Change. So a lot of regards for that. Shashi Buluswar Saab, please come on stage and share your thoughts with us.
Thank you. You know, every time I come to Pakistan, I feel like I have to start with a disclaimer, which is, I'm Indian. And so, anytime an Indian shows up so enthusiastically for something in Pakistan, you know it's got to be really good. Right? The thing that Zia wanted me to talk about was getting to know TCF. Right? I think over the last couple of days we've gotten to know it very well. So what I'd like to talk about is TCF in the context of international development writ large. Where has the movement gone? How does it stack up along questions like impact that was raised earlier? So shall we have the presentation up? Excellent. Let me start with the individual you just heard about. You know, usually not a week goes by when I don't talk to somebody about TCF. And the most recent occasion was when Nadeem reached out so I could write a letter of recommendation to a PhD program he's applying to. He's already in a PhD program and he wanted to transfer. And obviously, I got to know him through his work on the book. We'll talk about the co-author in just a second. And here's what I wrote. Nadeem does not know this. Please, it's meant to be confidential. And the thing I'd like to call your attention to, I'll give you a second to read it. The summary is, you know, teaching at Berkeley, I've written letters of recommendation for, I think, 60 some students. And this was the line that caught my attention because I didn't realize that's what I was going to say. The single most impressive person I'm writing a letter for. And I asked myself, why is that? And the truth is, the reason is I had been writing letters for middle-class kids from Berkeley, from the IITs in India, from MIT, and so on and so forth. But if I had written this letter for Aqsa, for the young Muhammad Rafi who was singing earlier today, I think I would have said the same thing about them. I think that this is a remarkable institution that produces amazing leaders. And what we'll talk about is that this is very, very, very hard work. And when you're in the trenches, when you're looking at the day-to-day, sometimes it can seem frustrating, but I'll give you the punchline right now, which is that this is the single most impressive NGO I've ever come across. And I'll tell you why. And what I'll do is talk about my experience with my journey with TCF, but really, in that timeline, the evolution of the global development space. Right? And I'll talk a little bit about my career, not because my career is particularly interesting, but there's a relevance here. So I started after finishing way too many degrees. I started at McKinsey. And as you know, it's a strategy consulting company. Right? And in those days, McKinsey did nothing in the social sector. I was there for a few years. And then for a bunch of really surreal reasons, I decided to quit and make a documentary film about cricket and cricket diplomacy. So it was about the India-Pakistan conflict, the history, and cricket diplomacy. That was the first time I had come to Pakistan. And I was in Karachi, and somebody said, hey, you like good people who do good stuff, so why don't you go to the school? So I went and visited the school. Truth be told, I wasn't paying much attention. The one thing I walked away with was, wow, I'm not really spending much time here, but this seems like it's better than, this was a TCF school, obviously, right? This is better than the middle-class school I went to in India. Went back to Chicago to continue working on the movie, and I met this dashing gentleman who's sitting right there, Daniel Nurani. And just by happenstance, I was, because I had left McKinsey, I decided to to dedicate the rest of my career to social issues. And I was just walking around listening to various talks. And Daniel came and gave a talk in Chicago at a restaurant on the street called Devon Avenue, which, if you don't know, it's essentially South Asia in Chicago. And I saw the analysis he was making, he was presenting through my McKinsey lens. Wow, this is actually, it makes sense from a very strategic point of view. I then moved to the Bay Area, to California, and I started teaching at Berkeley, and I joined a company called Dahlberg, which is essentially ex-McKinsey types, but focused on the social sector. And I'll tell you why this is relevant in just a second. Then, Daniel introduced me to someone who's become a very, very close friend over the years. This, as you probably know, is a picture from his obituary. And Amjad never let me off the hook. He would, not just for TCF stuff, but one of the few individuals in my life who kept pushing me to do more and more for the world. So he made sure, so as I was teaching, I would invite him every semester to come and lecture. And so my students in Berkeley got to know TCF quite well. And we'll see this in just a second, but as part of my work at Dahlberg, as part of my work as an academic, I started developing a particular framework for, lack of a better word, impact assessment, right, or effectiveness assessment. And not surprisingly, all the examples of the speakers, their institutions would get evaluated with all the data that was publicly available. Now, going back to the global development landscape, pre-2000, the world was very, very different, right? And the reason I'm saying that is that the NGO landscape was largely dominated by Western, honestly, feel-good organizations. In the year 2000, the Millennium Development Goals were announced. When they were initially announced, nobody cared. But very, very quickly thereafter, within a year or so, it became the rallying point for the global development sector to sort of put all the resources behind. Another really interesting thing happened around the turn of the century, which is that there are a bunch of, before we go there, so as the world rolled up its sleeves to work on these problems, there are a bunch of books that came out. Blue Sweater, 3 Cups of Tea, End of Poverty, Leaving Microsoft to Change the World. There's a theme here. That theme, for lack of a better phrase, is called the white savior mentality, right? They're all about, all of these books, at least 3 of these books, are about the journey of a well-meaning white individual and their experience of poverty for the first time. Those of us who live in South Asia, around poverty, certainly those of us who grew up around poverty, this is not news, but they would get all the attention. They would get, honestly, all the funding that was there. They'd get all the awards. And then, equally quickly, there was a response to that. William Easterly, another well-known economist, wrote this book called White Man's Burden, essentially saying we have to stop being patronizing. Dambisa Moyo wrote this book called Dead Aid. And what was important about Dambisa Moyo's book was that it was an African woman, for the first time saying this aid industrial complex is broken. Honestly, it's kind of corrupt. Right. Now, the other thing that happened around the turn of the century was a lot of IT millionaires and billionaires sold their shares and started their own foundations. The most significant of which was the Gates Foundation. The Gates Foundation is obviously unique in the sense that it is the largest philanthropic institution in the history of humankind. And they learned their lesson from the Green Revolution, from the 60s and 70s, essentially saying, let us introduce big solutions. Let's work with governments to change policy. Let's work with them to build institutions. And let's set up large international institutions. But again, it's a very, very unique institution. Then you had a whole movement, Omidyar Network being one example, towards impact investing. And the point here was, why don't we push organizations to be self-sustaining, ideally make a small profit? And then Another type of organization is one that many of us have come to know and love, which is the Skoll Foundation, and they were promoting disruptive ideas, social entrepreneurship. And the idea was, yeah, and in addition to that, for a whole bunch of reasons, including how the global economy and the economies of developing countries grew, you had a number of people from South Asia, from developing countries in the diaspora, in Western countries, start taking up positions of prominence in the corporate world, many of them also becoming wealthy. Likewise, at home, the number of millionaires started growing. Right? And so what that led to is a real need to shift away from the Western-driven model to homegrown solutions. Now, coming back to why I mentioned my career, this is when there was a big demand to go away from feel-good solutions to really strategic, business-driven solutions. And not just me, but a whole bunch of us from the corporate world, from the McKinseys of the world, it had an opening to switch careers and work in the social sector. And so what I started to do was, as I mentioned, as a professor, as a consultant to NGOs and a consultant to foundations, develop this framework for evaluating the effectiveness of social service organizations. And again, I will distinguish between impact versus effectiveness. Obviously, you have to deliver on your effectiveness to have impact. And it's a 7-part model, and I'll just bore you with the details for a second. Reach, that's obvious. How many people are you genuinely reaching? Second is lift, which is how much of a difference are you making in their lives? In the context of education, that is things like literacy, things like how many people are getting jobs, things like how many people are going on from primary to secondary, and so on. Efficiency, how well is the money being spent? When we're dealing with people who are earning very little, every penny counts. And sadly, in those days, a lot of NGOs were honestly not very efficient. There's way too much money being spent on very nice head offices, very, very exorbitant salaries for the executives and so on. Number 4 is sustainability. Not sustainability of the organization itself, necessarily, but also sustainability of the impact, meaning that let's say you're in health, you treat somebody for a condition today, they may fall sick tomorrow. Right? So whatever you are delivering has to sustain over at least a meaningful amount of time in the life of the individuals. Scalability, and scalability specifically what it means is economies of scale. Meaning as you grow, are you able to make everything more efficient? Replicability, which is if you're working in one context and you're doing fine, will those results hold in another context? And finally, catalytic effect, which is, there is no organization in the world that can change the world by itself. There is no organization in Pakistan that can solve Pakistan's education problems by itself, right? So ideally, it's a model that excites enough other organizations that they start copying your model. So we'll come back to the ratings for TCF in just a second. So time went on as organizations were starting to get more serious about getting beyond the nice photographs and the nice TED Talks. There were 3 realizations for each of these categories. On the social entrepreneurship side, these were inspiring individuals, but truth be told, there was a lot of hero worship. And beyond the TED Talk, beyond the awards, most of these organizations never really went anywhere. Impact investing, there was a lot of excitement about you can make money and you can make a difference. You know what the realization was? There's not a whole lot of money to be made in solving poverty. Right? And so there was a slippery slope, except that slippery slope was up, which is, maybe we won't help the poorest of the poor. Maybe the next year up and the next year up and so on and so forth. And, I've come across so many organizations, a well-known hospital in Kenya, for example, that got a lot of money to treat the poorest of the poor. Instead, it turned out to be a middle-class hospital. And so this, likewise in financial services, right? It's easy to jack up your interest rates just a little bit. So these stories are actually quite common. And so the impact investment segment of the industry realized, this is hard work, right? And then the large-scale stuff, right? The problem with these large-scale initiatives where they have massive budgets, where there's reliance on significant policy changes, is that the next elected government can change the policy just like that, right? And so each one of these things struggled for its own reason, but the world moved the ball in some meaningful way. So in that context, what I would do is I would ask each semester, I'd ask my students to evaluate all the NGOs that they'd come across. I'd even ask my colleagues, because as I would train my younger colleagues, I'd ask them to evaluate. So this is the aggregate over many years of how TCF was scored, not by me, but this is an aggregate and average over a large number of people. Okay. And I'm not sugarcoating stuff, right? And notice that there's a B plus there, right? And the reason there's a B plus there is that, on one hand, it's been a very hard act to follow. On the other, the governments are taking notice, the state governments are taking notice and saying, run our schools, the PPP partnership model. And so, but beyond that, it is a very, very solid report card. Across all the NGOs I've rated, and my students and my colleagues have rated, two stood out. Human Rights Watch is a Nobel Prize winning NGO, and TCF. Okay. And then, going back to our timeline, the SDGs were announced. And one of the things I realized as I was looking, continuing with my profession, is that the leading NGOs in the world already anticipated what was needed, things that were announced in the Sustainable Development Goals. For example, real gender equity. TCF was already there. Right? There was a question earlier about mental health. TCF was already there before it was recognized as an issue in the SDGs. And likewise with stuff like scale, in the social entrepreneurship world, I think Nadia was mentioning this earlier, which is, somebody builds 10 schools, 15 schools somewhere, it's celebrated. But this time TCF had reached 1,500, 2 orders of magnitude. And the question, of course, is sort of why isn't this recognized? And, being a little bit of an outsider, the harsh truth is that the global media actually would rather cover sad, bad stories about Pakistan, right? And this is what I would get very frustrated with a lot of my friends in various foundations, which is that, look, if you go to India, you can go visit the grantee, then you can do your week in an ashram in Kerala or whatever, right? And likewise, Bangladesh has kind of been the land of NGOs and the land of aid for a very long time. Pakistan, for a bunch of obvious reasons, has been a tough place to visit and work. And so the foundations have gone where it's easier to go. And that's why this story that should be celebrated in a just and fair world, has not been. Now, we all know the reasons why this is such an effective organization. I'll just quickly go through. This slide is usually for people who are not familiar with the organization, but we've seen all of this earlier, right? And I want to focus on that last thing, institutional DNA. I've been very fortunate in that I've got to work with some exceptional institutions, and there are certain things that they have in common. What are those? First of all, there's a method. Right? And that method is so solid that you can swap out the individuals and it'll continue. Okay. Second is, values that I personally deeply respect. These are not necessarily called out in TCF's value statement, but they're there. Audacity. The world's not going to change on its own. Humility. None of us is self-made. We may fail tomorrow. Let's not forget that we have to get up tomorrow and make sure that we're not slipping up. Third is urgency. Every day we waste. It's a burden to carry, right? Which is every day. If imagine, imagine if you were a physician, right? If you one day felt like I just won't go to work, people may die because of that. You see that urgency in TCF, which is, I'm not going to slack off today because if I do, others will suffer. And the last is agility, which is a certain adaptability particularly in the face of adversity. We saw this for COVID response, we saw this for the floods, and I suspect, even though, I've only, looked under the hood last couple of days, I suspect that even in the day-to-day of decisions around various operational aspects of the organization, there is that level of agility. And then the third is, what I say, good enough isn't good enough. It is so easy to celebrate that picture. There's no shortage of heartwarming stories at TCF. Yet, I don't see one person saying this is good enough. In fact, it is so interesting that there's so much pushback from board members and others. What is remarkable to me is, I spend time with lots of NGOs, right? There is so much excessive celebration among so many of them, whereas there's so many tough questions here. That is needed. That is what pushes the organization to greater levels of excellence. In my younger days, I used to be an athlete, and so I'll go back to sports metaphors. This is an Olympic gold medal, world record holding caliber organization. Yeah. I say this without any reservation. There's a but. That is Usain Bolt and Simone Biles. What are they doing the next Olympics? They're watching it. Because Olympic athletes get to retire. We don't get to retire. No matter how good we are, tomorrow there's another mountain to climb. Right? And once we climb that, there'll be another mountain, and there'll be another mountain. So what is that mountain for TCF? Well, use another sports metaphor. What do you see here? That was a really exciting match the other day, right? Friday. And actually came early, just hoping that the match would last into the fifth day. It was free. What do you see in the background? Right? What's going on here? T20, right? What is that telling us? The world is changing. Can you imagine, who would have thought, particularly given how long international cricket has been away from Pakistan, who would have thought there'd be a very high profile, very exciting test match? Nobody would bother showing up. I wouldn't have guessed that. Right? But the world is changing. And if we think of the spectators as our funders, as our stakeholders, we just need to make sure that we're listening to them, we know where they're going. One last sports metaphor, and I promise I'll stop, which is, there's this ice hockey player named Wayne Gretzky from Canada. So the Canada chapter can pat themselves on the back for this. The quote was, and I think it was him, "A good player knows where the ball is, always. A great player knows where the ball is going to be." Okay? So, what are the tea leaves telling us? Three big things. Right? One is that, we heard stories today about how a lot of individuals and foundations responded to flood relief. Even today, when you talk about Pakistan, most of the follow-up conversation from global funders is about the response to the things that were discussed at COP27 in Egypt, the climate change talks, right? Again, because of the floods. And so what I'm seeing across the board is, just given the urgency of the effects of climate change, more and more funders are dedicating a larger and larger portion of their portfolio to climate change. Obviously, it's important, but it does take away from stuff like education. Second is technology. Imagine 15 years back if somebody had told you every child from a very poor family in very poor parts of the world can actually have a tablet at their hands, what would we have said? Today, we take that for granted. So now, we're getting lots of pushback, lots of really interesting questions about what about the digital strategy, what about remote learning, and so on and so forth. The thing with technology is that the next big thing has happened. My PhD is actually in artificial intelligence, and until June 2022, and I stopped working in AI, I'd say in the late 90s, right, early 2000s, I would have said ho-hum. Not that much has happened. Everything that's happened is because of better computing and so on and so forth. 2 major systems were released last year, one by Google, the other by this company called OpenAI. And in the mathematical and computational science world, there's this thing called the Turing test. Basically what it means is, if you interact with a computational system, can you tell whether it's a human or a computer? For the first time, these 2 systems have passed the Turing test. It's a method called generative AI. And today you can go, it's called ChatGPT. If you interact with it, it is intelligent, right? Imagine what that does to teaching. I have a nephew who is studying physics, and everyone it's certainly in the US heard about ChatGPT about 2 months back. He got help deriving a very complex physics equation from this thing, just going back and forth. Right? Imagine what that level of interactivity does to teaching. Physicians today are using this thing to just dictate letters to their patients, and what the machine's able to do is just look up a lot of the context about the particular condition. Right? And truth be told, what's been released to the public right now is a fraction of the actual power of the system. I guarantee you, just as 15 years back, we would have scoffed at the idea of tablets being available to everybody, I guarantee you 15 years from now, AI will fundamentally disrupt a number of services, including education. So we have to get ahead of that. Right? We cannot be the test match. The third is, you heard this phrase, the future is female. It's got to be. Right? Exactly. And the tragedy is that the present isn't enough. Right? So, all uncomfortable facts. These are all uncomfortable facts. But again, what makes a great organization is that 2 things. One is, every day we get up saying, I will strap the world on my shoulders and take that step forward no matter how high the mountain is. Second is looking at ourselves in the mirror and saying, what can we do better? I have absolutely no doubt that TCF will overcome these mountains. And, I get unnecessary recognition. I don't think I've done a whole lot for the organization. But one promise I've made to myself is, for the next decade, I'll double whatever I'm doing for the organization. So, thank you.
Thank you for
Folks, I just want to say thank you so much, Shashi. I'll never forget a room in Berkeley. A very young UC Berkeley student wanted me to come over and talk to a bunch of students about TCF. In the end, there were 5 students there. The host was the 6th. And this kid was audacious enough to email Shashi. And Shashi is no regular guy on the West Coast. Shashi is taught at UC Berkeley. Shashi was there as the 7th person with his motorcycle helmet, and I was flabbergasted. I was like, "What are you doing here?" And he stayed the whole time. So I just want us to really recognize. He recognizes our humility, but really, thank you so much, Shashi, for being a part of this journey and showing what humility is all about.